Judgment is the brain's ability to draw conclusions about the world. When it draws inaccurate conclusions, it tends to make mistakes. But the reason it draws inaccurate conclusions has to do with how the brain constructs a mental representation of reality. Consciousness, as is defined in my work, is the brain's ability to construct a model of reality. But the brain is not capable of constructing a complete or accurate model of reality. So mental models usually contain missing or inaccurate information, which leads to inaccurate conclusions and mistakes in decisions. When people make decisions in their daily lives, they're often relying on a mental model of reality to determine what choice to make. And for most routine decisions, that's adequate enough. But when making highly consequential decisions that contain a significant amount of uncertainty, relying on a mental model of reality instead of seeking out more information will consistently result in wrong conclusions. One of the main reasons people use bad judgment, identified by my research, involves how they choose to handle uncertainty. When uncertain, a person has a number of choices. One could suspend judgment until more information is available. One could apply techniques for reducing uncertainty and seek out more information. Or one could form a belief, draw a logical conclusion, or rely on probability or social influences to explain those unknowns. Each of these choices leads to very different consequences. The problem with relying on beliefs, logic, probability, or social influence is that they are mental creations of reality and are not true and accurate representations of reality, so they are more likely to lead to wrong conclusions, misunderstandings, false accusations, and other negative consequences. What I'm about to show you are some of the most common causes of bad judgment. These behaviors are so pervasive throughout human societies that they are observable on any given day. And they sometimes result in some very harmful or costly consequences, making them some of the most compelling reasons for requiring people to learn cognitive skills. The first common cause of bad judgment is errors in logic. Logic consists of the reasons or arguments for a conclusion, and sometimes a person can arrive at an accurate conclusion using pure logic. An example would be a mathematician solving a math problem, where all the information required to arrive at a correct conclusion is available. Experts who have extensive knowledge of their subject can often use logic to deduce the correct answer. And frequently, people rely on logic as a heuristic to make daily choices. Unfortunately, the human brain doesn't store a complete or accurate model of reality. It has missing or inaccurate details that lead to wrong conclusions. The world that exists beyond the brain is very different from the mental model created by the brain. So in most circumstances, relying entirely on a mental model of reality to draw logical conclusions will consistently lead to wrong conclusions. Consider how a person may judge someone who is lonely or socially isolated. The reason for that person's social isolation is uncertain. However, many people will logically conclude, if the person is lonely and socially isolated, then the individual must not be very likable. Or if someone doesn't have a lot of likes on their social media platform, that person must be a terrible individual. In reality, the individual may simply not know many people, and it has nothing to do with how likable or intelligent the person is. That could be very hard on lonely and socially isolated individuals who have uncertain lives, uncertain pasts, and uncertain futures, and may be disbelieved into poverty. If logical statements like that can never be confirmed to be true, then they should never be mistaken as true. Or consider a job candidate who had a few short job stints. It's possible that the shortness of those job stints may have nothing to do with the individual's own choices or performance on the job. However, when hiring managers look at that person's resume, they may rely on a mental model of how the world works and conclude people who perform well on the job don't lose their jobs. Or if the job candidate was out of work for a period of time, the hiring manager may conclude the job candidate must not want to work. Again, these conclusions are purely mental creations that have nothing to do with reality. This is like seeing a damaged vehicle and automatically blaming the driver for causing an accident. Of course, the damage could be the result of another driver's actions. And the same is true with a damaged career. However, most hiring managers make assumptions or have a mental model about how other employers operate that truly has nothing to do with reality. So they disproportionately put blame on the job seeker whether or not that person is to blame. And that often results in a false accusation against the job candidate, which causes more unexplainable damage. In this way, wanting to believe something without caring about the truth simply because it makes logical sense can perpetuate a state of adversity and hardship for other people. The reason people develop these terrible thinking habits, like relying on beliefs, logic, and bad judgment, is because they grow up in an environment where others handle uncertainty in the same way. So those bad habits become normal and acceptable. Also, people mistakenly believe that relying on mental logic is the same as thinking when it's not. In decision-making, thinking is a process of reducing uncertainty in conclusions to avoid embarrassing mistakes. So if a person is relying on a mental model to draw a conclusion, that person is not making an effort to reduce uncertainty in that conclusion. Reducing uncertainty requires seeking out more information, not automatically assuming you have that information. The second common cause of bad judgment is perceived probability, which is a mental calculation that something will occur based on the frequency it was observed in the past. This is also a logical conclusion based on a mental model of reality that is more likely to result in mistakes. Unlike statistical probability, which relies on quantitative data and has practical applications, perceived probability is a subjective guess. The human brain relies on previous experiences to form expectations and make predictions about the world. And in many instances, that improves decision-making, especially when it applies to events that occur frequently, such as rush hour traffic. But it can also lead to wrong conclusions, especially when a person believes that something is probably true or probably false without any evidence. The individual is making a judgment purely based on the frequency these events were observed in the past. In psychology, this is often called the frequency illusion, which causes a person to believe or disbelieve a claim based on the frequency similar events were observed in the past. The problem with perceived probability is that the frequency an event is observed does not change the odds of its occurrence. Either the event occurs or it doesn't, regardless of beliefs, life experiences, or perceived probability. This type of bad judgment also leads to some very mean and cruel behaviors. Someone who is the victim of a crime that only affects a small percentage of the population may continue to be disbelieved, and those disbeliefs can become a harmful form of adversity. Perceived probability distorts how people think about and judge others they know little about. If they see a person claiming to have been victimized or having problems with employment, they may say, that person is the only person having that problem, so therefore it must be a problem with the individual. Again, that's a conclusion based on perceived probability, and not a conclusion based on real evidence or witnessed events. What really happened is uncertain, and that type of logic predictably leads to false accusations. Another instance is when a person makes an unbelievable statement or does something that's unbelievable. Many will automatically use probability from their own life experiences to conclude that the statement is probably a lie. That conclusion doesn't change the truth. Either it's true, it's false, or it's unknown. So disbelieving the individual and calling the person a liar could itself be a false accusation that could do harm to the person's reputation. The fact that the individual made what seems to be an unbelievable claim is merely a data point, and if more information is needed, then one could apply techniques for reducing uncertainty in those conclusions. The third common cause of bad judgment is social influence. Psychologist Robert Cialdini observed that when people are uncertain about what to do, they often look for social proof for guidance. In other words, if other people are doing it, it must be for a good reason. And that may seem like valid logic, but it's not always true and accurate. The tendency to rely on others for guidance develops at an early age, as children rely exclusively on family, friends, and teachers for knowledge about the world. Even throughout life, many adults look to thought leaders and influencers for guidance. People may even share the views and opinions of others out of a desire for belonging, even when those views are factually or morally wrong. Social influences can be a source of inaccurate information for many reasons. When uncertain, a natural tendency is to guess, speculate, or believe what someone else said, and those conclusions may have no basis in reality. Social media is a common source of misinformation. People chatting on podcasts may be inclined to speculate about the world. Content creators may be incentivized to lie, exaggerate, or create clickbait videos to acquire more subscribers, push their agenda, or sell more products. So relying on social influences is not the most accurate source of information and can lead to a lot of misinformation, misunderstandings, and mistakes if not fact-checked or researched with credible sources. The fourth common cause of bad judgment is brain function. The brain's ability to construct a complete and accurate model of reality also depends on brain function and memory, which are affected by many different factors. Brain function, or the brain's ability to interpret and respond to situational demands, has a profound effect on judgment and a person's ability to draw accurate conclusions. Neuroscientists have found that an undeveloped or damaged prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for many executive functions, significantly impairs judgment and results in poorer choices. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio and colleagues found that subjects with a damaged prefrontal cortex and damage to the emotional parts of the brain had reduced motivation, errors in judgment, and sometimes exhibited socially inappropriate behaviors. Age-related conditions, such as dementia, also impair judgment. Individuals with Alzheimer's may have difficulty predicting the consequences of decisions, such as wandering into a busy street during rush hour traffic, or giving money to strangers. In some instances, a person with Alzheimer's may have problems with grooming or hygiene, or difficulty judging distance while driving. Mental and emotional disorders also interfere with judgment. Most mental disorders, such as phobias, compulsive disorders, or anxiety disorders, are completely harmless and inconsequential. But mental disorders that create significant emotional distress can motivate harmful behaviors, including self-harm, harm to others, or other poor choices. When intoxicating substances are used in excess, they tend to contribute to a decline in brain health and poor judgment. Regardless of the reasons for consumption, all intoxicating substances have negative effects on behavior. They increase hostility and emotions, reduce impulse control, impair memory, slow cognitive function, and have other negative behavioral effects that could cause a decline in mental health. Memory also affects the accuracy of conclusions, and cognitive scientists have found that when the brain recalls an event, it attempts to reconstruct that event from memory. But the brain doesn't store a complete or accurate representation of life experiences, so memories of one-time experiences tend to be lacking in detail and filled with inaccuracies. Over time, the tendency to forget or inaccurately recall details also contributes to errors in judgment. So sometimes memory is unreliable and should be ignored to avoid false statements and wrong conclusions. One way to prevent cognitive decline is to eat healthy and get regular exercise. If you need an example, you can find a recipe for a nutritious meal and a maintenance routine in the appendix at the end of my book. And another way is to learn new things, which helps to stimulate new neural connections and keeps the brain young. All of these causes of bad judgment cause people to struggle to make moral and ethical choices. To behave morally and ethically, you have to know with certainty that your conclusions are accurate and your statements are true to avoid harmful or costly mistakes. You cannot use mental logic, probability, or any other form of bad judgment to draw conclusions about unknown details or unfamiliar people. These problems entirely stem from how a person chooses to handle uncertainty. Does the individual fill in the unknown details with logic, probability, or other mental creations? Does the individual suspend judgment until better information is available? Or does the individual seek out more information? These simple choices determine the consequences that person creates. The first choice is always bad judgment and will always result in wrong conclusions and a greater number of mistakes. However, if a person has better cognitive skills and is able to draw accurate conclusions and reduce uncertainty in conclusions, it predictably results in fewer mistakes. When people in the general public know how to use better judgment, it consistently results in fewer hostilities, fewer false accusations, more civilized behavior, and better solutions to human problems. Thank you for watching this video. These topics and many more can be found in my recent book entitled Decision-Making Skills: A Guide to Handling Uncertainty, Driving Results, and Cultivating Well-Being.